Hi, my name is Maddie Ehlers, and I am presenting on a trauma-informed classroom being an inclusive classroom. This kind of comes from the emerging trend of social emotional learning being incorporated in not only state standards, but a strong emphasis in schools across America right now as we learn more about trauma and their effects on the brain. Um, I do want to note that I am having some minor contractions as I'm recording this and bouncing on an exercise ball. So if I get out of breath or start to sound a little strange, that is what's happening. But I think we're going to be able to get through it just fine. So if we get to, let me see if I can get you to our second slide here when we're looking at our trauma definitions. This is where we're going to start. I'm going to define trauma for you, why this is so important to me, and some different ways that we can use a top-down approach of teaching students about their brain in order to have safe trauma-informed spaces rather than just using consequence reward behavior approaches in our school systems. So if we look at defining trauma, there's really exclusive definitions and very broad ones. So I tried to have a couple available for you here. So this is any event that alters the brain development of a child. So we've got capital T trauma, so this can be our really big events in our life, and then lowercase t trauma. The ACEs study is really commonly cited. This graphic comes from there, but I did not cite them in my slideshow today just because it tends to be really exclusive to all the different ways that we experience trauma and that children do. And it can tend to have racist outcome and really strong reflection of the white American home. And so because of that and the skewed results, I try and be careful when citing it. So if you look here though, this is just kind of the broad definition. So you're looking at abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. But we do know that there is also so many other places that we can have traumatic experiences. So hospitals, doctor's offices. A good example is like school systems. So I work on a reservation, and there's a lot of generational trauma and specifically tied to their experience in the school system. So we struggle having involvement with our grandparents and our parents and guardians because of their personal experiences and their traumas within the school system. So really important to note, it does not always reflect on the child's home life. This is a really, really common graphic that I'm sure you've seen before when looking at the experiences that alter children's brain development. So this is looking specifically at the temporal lobe. So on the left, you can see a healthy brain where a child's needs were met. And it's a really active and healthy temporal lobe. And then you see where a deprived brain on the right side is where a student's needs were not met and a lot of neglect. And so it is far less active and developed. So I'm going to kind of go into my next section, which is about teaching the brain exclusively. And this idea that we can really teach students about their brains and using language such as flipping their lid, or that their brain is dysregulated and that they want to be regulated or to calm down. I've had some really fun experiences. I've switched over from social work to education. So seeing kids from preschool to middle school using language that is really big or defining when talking to their brain. So it's really, really exciting to know how much they can learn. So something that I had done just this last year that was really easy because this was new to my school was during homeroom, I just incorporated Your Fantastic Elastic Brain by Sarah Ackerley. So this is using really strong language, as you can see just from the cover here, of the brain very specifically, and teaching kids what is happening and kind of the science behind it. So rather than just teaching our SEL, which is what their emotions feel like in their body, we can teach what's happening in their brain when those emotions are coming up. So this graph is in my room in a couple different places, and I use it to talk to students specifically about what's happening in certain areas of their brain at that time. So reptilian brain, so if you look over here, that's going to be our orange section. Then we've got our limbic system, so that's our emotional brain, and our logical, the neocortex. So reptilian brain, this is for preservation, right? This is our surviving. It's extremely resistant to change, and it is always looking and scanning for threats. If our limbic system, this is our emotional response control centers at the amygdala there, and then we've got our memory center, our hippocampus. Um, and then we've got our logical brain. I think it's really interesting when we think of our students who are typically following our directions, compliant. Um, that is going to be that they're operating out of this logical brain because they're fully developed. So if we look at our limbic system here, so remember that's the emotional brain. So this is so important. If we're teaching teachers this, it gives them so much power and knowledge that some of their children's brains, if they're operating out of this area, they're only able to process moment-to-moment survival. This handles only the next 15 seconds of life. And when they're operating out of the next 15 seconds of life, they're not consciously thinking through what is right and wrong, natural consequences. It is really important that this area of the brain is scanning for threats, and not just an actual existence of a threat, but a perceived threat. So if you have ever had a student have an outburst, or struggle that doesn't seem to make sense, it doesn't always have to. If their brain just perceives it as a threat, that is enough, rather than it just being one. So in a safe and secure environment, this area is fully developed at age 4. For our students who have not necessarily had that development all the way, we can see them really heavily operating out of this area of the brain when their body's dumping cortisol, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So if we look at our logical brain, so this is in charge of our top down. I have some really cool graphics that I have elementary school kids work through when talking about a top down brain and their emotional brain. So if their emotional brain becomes overpowering, it first releases adrenaline, and then within 5 minutes it adds cortisol. And what do we know? When cortisol is activated in the emotional brain, the functioning of the logistical brain is impaired for a minimum of 30 minutes. This is incredibly important to know because I think oftentimes we tell students if they do have an outburst, if you got a student who threw a chair or threw somebody's crayons, we're telling them they need to come and apologize or calm down and come join the class. The time that they're sitting, and if it appears like they're moping or if they're continuing to throw crayons in the corner, we're saying, well, this is your recess time. The time that you waste here, I'll take your time, right? It can be a really common consequence that we walk through, but we know that a student for 30 minutes at a minimum cannot fully comprehend that conversation even. And it's not just out of them being stubborn or being upset. We can know physically in their brain with that cortisol being dumped that they're impaired to be able to have that conversation and think through. So if we look at traditional perspective, students need to learn to be responsible for their own actions. There are natural consequences to those actions, right? You throw my special crayons that I bought with my money, well, then you don't get to use the special crayons. But if we look at the trauma-informed perspective, and we're encouraging ownership of self-teaching by regulated and dysregulated brain, so if instead you have a student, once they do that, they sit at the calm down corner, they're not talked through consequences, they're not talked through why you're disappointed with them, they just regulate by coloring, by rocking in the chair, and once their brain comes to a regulated state, you then walk through what in their body made them throw those crayons. What can we do instead when we start to feel that feeling? Maybe we need to come to the rocking chair before, right, when we start to feel that way, instead of when it's too late, and after get to a regulated state. So this graphic shows hyperarousal and hypoarousal. For time's sake, I'll just let you look at this. And so this is when we have all that cortisol. So trauma, we can look at, this is your fight, flight, freeze. So you're gonna have students in both categories. And it can be really difficult because when we've got trauma students who are in the hypoarousal, they're not always on our radar as prevalently as those who are really disrupting the room on the hyperarousal. And being anxious and loud and impulsive. And our hypoarousal is being defiant, withdrawing, often have their hood up, and avoiding tasks. And so I have an important note leading into that. When we have our students, when we're implementing things like PBIS right now in our classrooms and schools, it's so important to use it as a roadmap rather than ensuring we're looking for compliant behavior. So if you are complimenting and giving a star card and affirmations to your students who are standing in line nicely or transitioning nicely, and really affirming that behavior instead of also addressing the students who are struggling to transition and try and find out why that is. Is it because their brain is always scanning? And so that can be alarming to them to transition really quickly. So then you as the teacher you can affirm your students, but then you also need to incorporate things like adding a 2-minute timer in for transition, giving them a heads up when a transition will happen. Maybe moving certain students to the back of the line so they don't have students behind them, things like that. I meant to have that specifically here, sorry. If we're talking about transitioning. So if you look at a goal, it's that blank will stand in line during class, transition with hands at his side, 6 out of 8 daily transitions. So then what we want to do, if we're looking through a trauma-informed perspective, knowing what we do about dysregulation, we can start to brainstorm ways, I got ahead of myself there, that it might be a trigger for the students. So rather than just having PBIS affirming your positive behavior, you want to incorporate some ways to make sure that you are teaching to all of your students and their whole body teaching. So you can add in a short exercise. I have added in, so instead of singling out your 2 students who struggle with this before you line up, have all of your students do 10 jumping jacks really fast. And the more that you teach this, the more they can do that really quickly and know that that's just part of their routine, that they're going to get an activity before they move on to their next transition. So here are some quick ideas for incorporating and teaching regulating strategies in a general ed classroom. So these are breathing techniques. These are super, super simple. There are hundreds of them on the internet and on YouTube and really great sites. So you can incorporate these on certain days. You can have a day where you teach a new one, morning meeting, during tests, during homeroom. It's really fun to see kids then use this themselves. You can add them to the calming corner or write the name of them on their desk as a reminder if they have a particular one that works well for them. Incorporating movement. This goes beyond, this is what I've really been working on myself, is incorporating whole body, their whole bodies into the learning experience rather than just having brain breaks where we have movement. So teaching vocab by connecting it to a physical motion, doing gallery walks instead of just raising hands, asking students to stand up, to do a jumping jack, push up or spin. So kind of just adding movement in far more than just our standard ways of a brain break or a transition. So then I always, in all of my classrooms, have a regulation station. So it's a calming corner, but I like to teach the language of dysregulated and a regulated brain. So this can look like incorporating movement. You've got the step stool there. I've seen where they have the pedals under desks, having a rocking chair, and you can teach them, when you teach how to explicitly use all of these tools and strategies, it's really cool because you can teach what's happening in the brain. So with rocking and why rocking can be so helpful, having fidgets, having things for them to look at, colors. These timers are really good, so you can they'll flip it over and they'll give themselves 5 minutes and kind of teach them how to advocate and learn what works best. Transitions, as we learned, if you have students who are operating out of their emotional brain, transitions are so tricky because it can feel like a perceived threat if not given proper warning that a transition will happen. And sometimes we can as teachers, right? Things happen differently that day, or schedules need to change for different reasons. So these are some different calming ways to slowly transition to give structure to a maybe unstructured time that can be really helpful. So I am so thankful that you have listened to this. There are so many different things being talked about right now in the education system, and it is a emerging trend when it comes to talking about our students' mental health, especially in the conversation of returning from COVID. So I'm really thankful that I got to talk about brain development and using that specific approach when we're teaching students how to advocate for themselves, how to learn what's happening in their own brains, and to be able to regulate through co-regulation or self-regulation. So thank you so much.